Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Cami Fletcher, historian and president of the Collective for Radical Death Studies, CRDS for short, and welcome to the second of two Q&A Rad Death Reads with our Rad Death authors. In this month of August, the Collective for Radical Death Studies hosted our hashtag Rad Death Reads entitled Mass Death and Social Justice. With a sold out audience, we discussed the book Digging for the Disappeared, written by Dr. Adam Rosenblatt, which looked at the rise of the forensic human rights movement, its guiding principles, and how forensic teams became political actors and influencers with conflict, post-conflict areas. We also discussed the documentary Potter's Field, which examines the silent masses of homeless deaths that are happening in our own backyards, especially given that the US has a devastating COVID-19 death toll. Lastly, we discussed the essay Ordering Chaos, written by today's guest, Dr. Donald Joralemon. The essay asks how the collective loss of life related to acts of terrorism is characterized by passionate debate and intense disagreements over how and what to remember. But for more on these hashtag Rad Death Reads, please visit the Decolonizing Death section of our website, www.radicaldeathstudies.com. So let's go ahead and get into today's discussion. Again, Dr. Joralemon, thank you so much for being here. First, can you please tell us who you are, your background, and then most of all, how you came to study death?
I'll keep it very short. I am a medical anthropologist specializing in South America for my ethnographic field work, and then subsequently doing work on organ transplantation in the United States, and then much more recently on the subject of the customs of death in America. So I've had this sort of ongoing story and death dating back to, a very long time ago. The particular essay was written for a conference in England, and I wrote it because I had in the back of my mind strong memories of the politics surrounding the Vietnam War Memorial and the construction of the memorial at the World Trade Center. And it just occurred to me that those were events that I needed to understand better. So I thought I'd take some time thinking about how we remember mass death.
So the September 11th, that memorial really sparked this article, trying to understand it. Had you visited Ground Zero?
When I wrote the article, it had not yet opened, but before it was published, I did. It was still in construction when I wrote the article.
Did you visit Ground Zero even before the memorial? And so, because I'm wondering, because I remember going there as well before the memorial was there, and I'm wondering how that influenced your ideas of grieving, your ideas of death and remembrance, kind of this before and after, right? Visiting Ground Zero and, visiting the memorial. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I did visit it before it opened, and was particularly struck by the very small memorial in the church right across the street from Ground Zero. On the one hand, you saw the chaos of construction of the site itself right outside the door, but when you entered the church, there was this extraordinary peace and sorrow associated with the memorial that had been set up in that church, a church which had served as a kind of respite spot for the emergency responders. And then when I came back to actually see it once it had opened, the museum had not opened yet, but the site itself was open. It just struck me as what a remarkable transformation of a site from rubble to this glorious garden and beautiful fountains. And I thought to myself, what does that mean, that we can somehow sanitize the horror that was behind that place? In a way that seemed to me still to be very much full of sadness.
Do you remember the denomination of this church? Was it a mosque or it was?
No, it was a Protestant church. I can't remember the particular denomination.
No, I'm interested because I remember just the conversation and the uptick in racism, regarding Islam at that point, and your juxtaposition of the chaos right outside with the rubble and then this piece. I was curious about that.
Yeah, I think I would be projecting backwards if I told you that at the moment that I was there, that was on my mind. It
Mm.
emerged as a theme as I watched the reaction to the construction of the memorial and to its response to by the public.
Okay. Okay. One of the first questions I wanted to ask you was about the term therapeutic memorials, a term that you use in your piece here that's borrowed by scholar Kirk Savage. Could you share your thoughts on what you learned from this research, even more than you've shared now, and this idea of really healing and grieving?
I thought his idea was particularly challenging to subject to some critical thought because hidden underneath those simple terms, therapeutic memorial, is the assumption that somehow if we get it right, if we build the right building or the right memorial structure, that somehow we will have overcome the trauma that that event masks or marks. And that seemed to me to be a peculiar argument, and I wasn't persuaded by it. I wanted to ask myself whether the process of creating those sites and their response afterwards confirms this idea that a memorial can be restorative. Now, I had seen certainly cases where memorials did serve that purpose. If you go to the Vietnam War Memorial in DC, you see people actively grieving at the site, leaving behind artifacts that associate their own current life with the death of somebody whose name appears on the wall. And it seemed really clear that that's in some sense a healing act for them. But at the same time, an awful lot of the process by which these memorials get designed and executed and the kind of response to them once they're up made me question whether this idea that grief shared is grief released is really an accurate depiction. It seemed to me not as easy as the term itself might have suggested.
Yeah, in the four memorials that you point out, immediately thought about what's going on in our country right now. This idea of building to have this space to collectively grieve, but the idea of tearing it down as well. So the idea of a lot of Confederate monuments. I mean, just yesterday I saw one just constantly coming down. And then even thinking about the title Order and Chaos in that kind of aggressive tearing down and the reimagining, right? And one of them, Harriet Tubman has been projected on. Black Lives Matter has been projected on to the Robert E. Lee. I'm just curious on your thoughts of who really then are these memorials for? Is it, or is it supposed to be unifying in our patriotism? And then if that patriotism is splintered by racism and oppression, then I was just hoping we could spend a little time talking about that. Then what are we doing then?
Yeah, you're asking exactly the right questions, and I'm not sure I have the right answers, except to say that the way America goes about remembering mass murder is quite in contrast to the way that other countries have engaged in the same act. And I think what distinguishes America is precisely what you've just pinpointed, the idea that somehow the memorial celebrates this fictitious view of America as a kind of phoenix rising from the ashes, that the very fact that we survived these acts of terrorism confirms the uniqueness and grandness of America. That is very common in the memorials that at least the Oklahoma City and World Trade Center sites. It is quite explicit that that's a kind of political message that is intended. If you look at the memorials in Spain and in England, that kind of glorification of the nation state is not in evidence. They're really much more about the lost lives associated with that act.
Mm, mm. So how do we grieve then? right? Because even in your piece, I was thinking about, well, that's interesting. So Candy Can in her book, Virtual Afterlives, this idea that we're in this death denial culture, and even my own research with the RIP t-shirt, this is a way for the living to map on, mourning to this death denial culture. But I thought, what about spaces where there is tension there, spaces like the Southern Plantation, where mass death absolutely occurred, but it's similar with the Confederate Memorial, where the South or the loser is allowed to tell the story. So I'm just wondering about, these grieving, these spaces that can allow this grieving, as in what you were saying with the Vietnam Memorial. People can leave things, leave tokens. So when you were writing this, or even now, did any of that come to your mind? Like, are there other spaces that we're leaving out, that places that could be spaces for folks to grieve and heal, that we're just not acknowledging?
Absolutely, and let me see if I can tie a couple of your thoughts together, because I think you've made a couple of really important observations. First of all, the very act of reforming or reimagining a monument can, I think, serve a more therapeutic purpose than the monument itself. Because in fact, that becomes a collective act that says, no, the memory that you're promoting is not our memory. We want to create another narrative. And I think that kind of action, whether it be a Confederate monument or requiring a modification of the signage at a plantation, or rethinking how we understand Jefferson's home or the battlefields of the Civil War, those actions, I think, in an odd way, can be more restorative than the memorial was in its first incarnation. That the challenging those can be a healing act more than the building itself. Well, help me out, Cami. You had a second part.
Yeah, no, just the idea of, I'm thinking about in my own research, in trying to uncover a slave burial ground right here in Maryland.
Right.
And it was a hyper focus on, are there really people there buried, right? Because this transient kind of nature of being bought out, being hired out, by like 1820, 1830, or really earlier than that, 1808 to 1865 when it left. And I kept thinking, 5 people generationally. Generationally, you saw the record, suckling infant lived here. So mass death occurred here. And I'm just wondering, how can we turn those spaces into spaces we're grieving? And then, I guess, to go further with my thought, is what Brian Stevenson did with the National Museum of Peace and Justice that I visited in 2018, shortly after it opened. You can't do that is a space of grieving as we confront the atrocity. And so maybe it's the confrontation that I'm talking about.
Yeah, that reminded me of exactly what part of your question I wanted to respond to. You asked if there are other spaces where grieving is maybe more effectively accomplished, and I think there are. And I would point to the museum in Alabama as a really good example of that. I haven't had the fortune to be able to get there yet, but I've heard tales of the incredible power of that place. What's remarkable about it is that it debunks the idea that you can only have a memorial either to the individual who's died or to a mass who died in one incident. Because instead, what that is a collective, over time, celebration of the lives of people who were murdered by lynching. And collectively understanding that by creating a memorial to that mass loss of life, we are in fact testifying to its importance in a way that we hadn't beforehand. So absolutely, I think there are other spaces, and that would be a really good example. I also realized that, in addition, although I focused on 2 Native American incidents of massacres and talked about them because they're so clearly examples of how an incident of mass murder can be politically manipulated to be something other than what it really was, I also realized that it would have been a wonderful kind of contrast case to talk about the massacre in Tulsa, because it took nearly 50 years for a memorial to be erected in that city, despite the fact that it was a massacre by any definition. And I thought that that might have been a good counterpoint to the Native American cases. That thought did not occur to me when I was writing the article.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you know, you brought that up as well. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about, let's see, the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, which you clearly say it wasn't until D. Brown, right? This Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, HBO dramatized the series, did an amazing job on it. 1970, from 1890 to 1970, the narrative was oh God, Grant, Ulysses Grant, um, did his duty. And so, okay, let me back up. In thinking about the idea of these indigenous people and how they wanted to memorialize themselves, which is what I love about you centering that on there. There's an undeniable thread of whiteness, of racism that you do not shy away from. You know, at the end of this, you say, I think they have it right. The Lakota's like, no, you caused this massacre. We don't want your money. We don't want your memorial. We don't want your national park. So it's a couple of things I hope to unpack, you know, focusing on, you know, the Native Americans. And the historian me wants to say this. So when you think about Andrew Jackson and his idea that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, horrific, terrible genocide language, the Trail of Tears, when you think about all the swindling and the manipulation with from the Dolls Act to, I mean, just everything. I think I'm overwhelmed even just thinking about this. How can you have a memorial for healing on land that's covered in blood? I mean, I don't even know how else to say it, but I guess we could just start trying to unpack it there.
I think for the Lakota, the very fact that it is a memorial on the site of the burial of all of their kin is precisely what gave them the strength to refuse to have it co-opted by the federal government of the United States. They recognized that that was sacred space, and it was their sacred space. They weren't about to allow it to be cleansed of that history. It's striking to me that part of the debate about Oklahoma City precisely had to do with whether the unidentified remains could be left in the ground at the site itself. And there was a rejection of that idea. And indeed, ultimately, they were relocated to be buried elsewhere. So there, and the same argument about whether or not the site of the World Trade Center, whether somehow that blood had to be removed for there to be exercise in healing. Well, the power of the Lakota rejection is precisely that they have told us, no, we suffered and continue to suffer precisely because this is where the blood was shed. And we're not going to let you tell the story in any other way. That, I think, is the power of the message of Wounded Knee.
Yeah, yeah. And just really pushing back on the colonialism of it all. And you know, you talk about in here where folks go, as I underlined it, Americans wanting to be a part of this. The term is thanatourism, dark tourism, wanting to be, you know, I want to see, I don't know. But and I'm reading this as white people going to these spaces, and you use the term like disappointed, yeah, poor, terrible, looking at TripAdvisor. And again, I was reminded 2 years ago, there was a woman, a white woman, that went to a plantation. You know, I'm not sure if it was Monticello, if it was a smaller one that I worked on, and left a comment saying that she was disappointed. I mean, she was and upset, and it went viral. The fact that she went, it was her vacation or spring break with her and her family, and the audacity of that place to try to teach her about slavery, and she was upset about it, and it just went viral. And I thought about this: what do you expect? Like, what do you expect And is there an understanding? We're talking about grieving and memorials and therapy and moving on. Is there an understanding of the death and that this is genocide? And I guess that's just a question for you as, someone researching this. And then did you yourself, as a racialized white male in our society having, at the top, the power type thing, did you yourself feel, because death has a way of doing that, I think, for folks in power. Like, did you yourself feel like you had to confront some of these things? And yeah, just curious.
Yes, I felt as though, well, first of all, I had a gut reaction as I was doing this work, especially on Wounded Knee, that just made me have a very hard time understanding the willingness of not only those at the time, but for decades and decades afterwards, to deny the fact of what happened there. That just seemed to me to be an unbelievable exercise in denial, and just a part of this ongoing effort to exterminate both the bodies of Native Americans and their memories. And that just, it made me feel that it had some alternative story had to be given room to be told. And I thought by contrasting that to the sanitized exercise for memorialization at Oklahoma City and for the World Trade Center, that the contrast would underscore the degree to which the very notion of closure is itself a white creation, a white way of thinking about the way that we mourn, as though it's on a timeline. You go from the event itself, and then assuming that you're healthy psychologically, you get through your grief, and then you get back to life. Well, I think there's an awful lot of people in the world who don't see grief as something that you get over or for which there is any closure. And I believe that that would probably be the way that the Lakota would express their commitment to maintaining their site and their memories.
Mm, mm. A follow-up to that, I'm curious, especially there's such strong resistance, and it should be, of them saying, no, we don't want your dollars, we don't want your memorial. Do you feel that in writing this, you were able to just show that pushback? Because I'm sure people may say, well, why write this? You don't identify as Native American. Are there other scholars, that are indigenous, that are Lakota, that are writing about this, maybe voices that you could have centered? Do you feel like that this was your way to kind of push back and decenter that whiteness, just to kind of take your comments a step further?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Native Americans have been vocal about the meaning of Wounded Knee and about the distortion of history that went into the white telling of that event. And so I didn't feel as though somehow there was a missing narrative that I was filling in. But rather, I thought that the contrast that I was drawing between the memorial at Wounded Knee and the others that are included in the essay was would move us a little bit further beyond the particulars of Wounded Knee and allow us to see some wider issues about mourning and memory that would sensitize us to the politics involved in who we remember and how.
Yeah, I get that. So with the 1995 bombing, just thinking about the contrast here, in Oklahoma, this terrorist, or do we call it domestic terrorist bombing? Um, how does that help us understand who we are in our identity? It just seems to be that, especially with the ones that you picked out for your article, and I think rightly so, there's a real us against them. And in this, I'm not really sure. It just seems to be they want to remember. I don't know. Could just elaborate and help me understand what's going on here.
To the degree that I'm able to, let me suggest one way of thinking about it. It seems to me, first of all, very clearly in the whole process of designing the memorial that right at the heart of it was the idea that if you create a kind of, I keep using the word sanitized because that's what it is, a sanitized version of what happened. If you take down the ruins and you build back a memorial that cleanly describes it, but you also put just enough reality in there so that the voyeuristic impulse can be satisfied, that there's a sort of assumption that we've quarantined the terror, right? We've said it happened here, yes, we're getting over it, but we've risen from it. We've dealt with it. We don't even need to mention or virtually not mention the individual who did it. We can squirrel his name and the fact that we put him to death away in a little tiny corner of the museum, just as they did in the case of the World Trade Center. And it seems to me that that's an act to try to say it happened there, but it may not happen again because we are stronger than that. That's why this image of strength occurs over and over again. It occurred in Boston. Boston strong. That metaphor keeps happening with responses to mass murder. I think it's a story we're telling ourselves that says, from time to time, really bad things happen, but we are such a strong country, we will rise above it. And I think that's Native Americans aren't going to tell you that they're rising above the atrocities committed against them by white Americans. I don't think African Americans are going to say that the atrocities committed against their people, their ancestors, is somehow cleansed by a particular kind of monument. It seems to me like that's where the challenge to remembering lies.
I think that's a good takeaway after reading this, right? It's not just denying death, but even in our memorials, we're doing it, this idea of strength. You're right, Boston Strong. Is the sanitizing also the denial? Like I'm thinking about all of these school shootings and the narrative surrounding is just such denial. And you touched on that as well. You either build a memorial, and even thinking about what you were saying with the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, right? You're just completely denying it. And I was looking online for it. I don't know if the memorial, the way they wanted it, there's supposed to be a park. I don't even think all that's built. I know that there's a wall of memory there, and it really came into the media when Trump was, down there and they covered it, make sure it wasn't a photo op. But just going back to this idea of sanitizing and denial and using strength to cover it, is that just the American way? Is that just our American experience with death, the exceptionalism? I mean, what are your thoughts on
it? I think there are cross currents. Certainly, your own experience looking at the way that plantations get sanitized is a perfect example. I mean, they become backdrops for fancy weddings instead of a story about enslavement. But at the same time, there are scholars like you who insist on us remembering the actual facts of people being murdered there. I think that while there is certainly a powerful motive to deny the ongoing significance of these mass murders, there are also cross currents that keep reminding us that they cannot be forgotten, that to forget them is to...
Yeah. So then are we really sharing this grief? Because this comes up, in your article as well. And I didn't think about it in that way. It's like, it doesn't matter. Death is very communal, right? This person has died. I feel the grief, and it's this, I guess you could say, a ripple effect, but my grief isn't lessened. And I think you make a powerful argument about that as well. Do you think that is where that idea of being, strong comes in, if we share it? Or what do you want us to take away from that, this idea of grieving and supposedly being shared by this memorial?
Yeah, the notion of shared grief is a really complicated one because it assumes a kind of entitlement to partake in somebody else's suffering. And I'm not sure we have the right to make that claim. So I'm troubled by the very notion that by building a memorial, we somehow are sharing the grief of those who lost family members or ancestors by the acts of murder that that memorial remembers. At the same time, there is a kind of educational value in having memorials that teach us of the real story, not the fictionalized story, but the real story. That's why the Alabama Museum is so powerful, because it doesn't white coat it. It says exactly what happened in the South up until very recent years. On the other hand, I'm not so sure Oklahoma City Memorial does that. Because it tries to deny and squirrel away the fact that this was an act of domestic terrorism. It was a homegrown murderer who decided to blow up the federal building. So I think that if there's a takeaway, it's that it's got to be treated as a problematic issue on an ongoing basis. We're not finished the work of remembering by building a memorial. That remembering, that act of sympathizing with those who suffered doesn't end by buying a ticket to go to see the museum at the World Trade Center.
You know, you make me think about this, the idea of public opinion and how just so poignantly on the Wounded Knee Massacre. You know, it wasn't until we didn't have this idea of you know, kill the Indian, save the man. Again, just all this type of genocidal language that infuses a memorial. And then I'm also thinking about the parties involved, right? You know, it has historical value, what you're saying these memorials do, because once everybody that remembers the event dies, then, you know, at least we have this here, you know, this is what you've pointed out, especially with the Titanic. But how do you get groups involved to build a memorial without it being really this idea of consumerism, right? Death is, and I'm personally, I'm against that idea that, you know, we're consumers with that. But do you see that thread coming in there? Because when I, you know, reading this, the different parties coming together to make this memorial consuming, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is, I think, one of the most troubling parts about the memorialization of mass murder, the impulse to make it a destination for visitors versus a remembrance of an act. And you see that over and over again. It's not just Oklahoma City and the World Trade Center. There's plenty of examples where the motive behind the construction of a memorial is as much driven by the commercial opportunity that site represents as it is a sincere wish to record the incident that happened there. And I find that not only deeply troubling, but also something which you don't find, to my way of thinking, or at least in my understanding, you don't find at the heart of similar memorials in other countries. Other countries just don't seem to participate in this idea that mass murder ought to be on the tourist circuit. It seems like we are, I don't know what, it gets away from this idea of death denial, because at the opposite extreme, it seems to be death celebration so long as it's been sanitized, so long as it's been cleansed. I want to see it. I want it to be a nice tourist site with appropriate mementos for me to purchase. I want it nice and clean. I want it to be well tended so I can go with my family to visit it. And I want to be able to buy a t-shirt. That I find incredibly offensive. When I went to the World Trade Center when it opened, I actually went into the gift store and I kept asking myself, why is there a gift store at a site commemorating? But there is.
That's troubling. That's something to sit with. I have not been, and I can tell you that there is not a gift store at the National Peace and Justice Museum. I can tell you that those pillars, those copper colored pillars that are designed as you walk down to, then you look up as in hanging bodies, they have them laid out because it's an outdoor museum. They have them laid out and they look like coffins, and they encourage you to buy these for your county to put up in the local historical site, the local historical museum or something like that. Wow, that is something to sit with. Okay, I didn't expect that done. So is I'm trying to make a connection between the way Americans tour cemeteries. Now, full disclosure, being from the South, and maybe maybe I'm different, but being from the South, you didn't tour cemeteries. I mean, you went to visit your loved ones, but as someone that's a death scholar now, I'm learning, lots of things. But to your comments, is there a connection with the way that people the beauty that people find in viewing cemeteries with this thanatourism? I mean, what are your thoughts on that, kind of connecting what you just said with that gift shop?
I think there are as many different sorts of cemeteries as there are people who choose to go visit them and their motives. I think there is a real striking contrast, for example, between what you just described and the very famous cemetery in Savannah, Georgia. People chose to put up very striking monuments to their dead precisely because they expected people to come and visit it. So there's a tombstone in the form of a piano. There's all sorts of very kind of over the top memorialization of the dead there. And those were not, I think, put up primarily for the descendants of the deceased. I think it was a part of this movement that we saw in Boston at the Mount Auburn Cemetery, where the cemetery becomes a park that you go to visit on a Sunday afternoon and you bring a picnic. And I think that is consistent with the kind of touristic value of memorials to mass murder. But at the same time, there are far more cemeteries for which it is only the descendants that are the visitors. That certainly is the vast majority of cemeteries in America. And I make a habit of trying to get to every cemetery I can find when I'm traveling. And I see the tremendous diversity in how the dead are remembered in different parts of this country and in different and for different sectors of the American population.
Yeah, no, that Rural Garden Cemetery to the Lawn Cemetery movement, yeah, that you're talking about, late 19th century, I think is precisely what's going on here. And it seems to, as we've gone to the 20th century, 21st century, there's been a ratcheting up of our voyeurism. It's not just the cemetery, it's not just the memorial. I just can't imagine. But again, I can, because there's gift shops at the plantation.
Yeah.
And that's where the tour ends. The tour guide, the docent leads you there. And it's a place where I've spent time. At one of them, my life mate collects money, and I was reminded there was, duplicate Confederate money there, and again, that becomes a teaching tool. As a professor, what do you do where you have this piece of currency that has Black folks picking cotton? Then we can tell a narrative. Wow. That I'm still thinking about that. I did not expect. I just didn't expect you to say that. This idea of having a gift shop, that just takes this idea to a whole nother level.
It does.
It really does. But in the era of COVID, I think really pretty much my questions end here. We can go back to anything else, but my questions kind of really end here. In this era of COVID-19, where I would say death denial is taken to another level. I mean, Don, where are we now? Are we up? Are we at 200,000 Americans have died?
What time is it?
Right. And
Yeah.
and we're just from the leadership to the leadership. How would you think, maybe I'll ask, us try to understand this mass death that's happening, that just seems to be, with your words, sanitized, because we're not really seeing it with the news, with the administration. But how do you think your article can try to help us understand this moment of mass death?
Kenny, I'm going to let you down because I don't think I have an easy answer to that question. I can certainly say that there are some aspects of the pandemic which ought to be getting far more attention than it's getting, and that is the way that it is raging across sectors of our population disproportionately. So it isn't everybody who is suffering as a result of the pandemic, or at least suffering the same likelihood of death. I would love to go back and see what happened in the aftermath of the flu epidemic in the early part of the 20th century and see if that was similarly denied. It seems as though when an epidemic like this kicks in with such force over such a large number of people, that it may simply overwhelm our capacity to manage it. It may be something more than we can even get our heads around. And we are coming up on 200,000 dead Americans. I don't even know how you begin to calculate that when they are dead Americans across every state and by every way of thinking about the American population. It is a very difficult chore. You certainly don't do it the way that the current administration is, which is to pretend it isn't happening or that it already is over. That's not the answer to a reckoning with the facts of this pandemic.
I think that's well said. I think that's well said. Do you also think that this reckoning will be a reckoning with our own American identity? It just seems to be laying bare what you said. It's not happening in every community. Is it going to lay bare this oppression that has always been there? We've seen that with the countless deaths of Black folks continuing to die, not by COVID, but racism. We've seen the countless number of people of color. It's ravaging the Native American population, because of our healthcare system that's inadequate. So do you think at the end of this, because we have to call it mass death, that there'll be some reckoning with our identity as Americans, and maybe then we can begin to stop denying death. Maybe I'm a little too hopeful.
Please keep that up. I think that what troubled me most in the early months of the pandemic was the news reporting suggesting that it was somehow a surprise that African Americans and Native Americans were dying at disproportionate rates. That's no surprise. That's been true of our medical history for centuries. And to somehow think that this was a pandemic urgent news struck me as disingenuous. It seemed as it really ought to have been treated as confirmation of what we already knew, and demonstration of what happens when you don't pay attention to that reality. But instead, it just seemed to be a kind of footnote to the nightly count of how many were being tested and how many were dying. Oh, and by the way, more of those people tend to be African Americans and Native Americans and the elderly. Well, that didn't strike me as news. It seemed to me like maybe we should have been asking, why is it that seems surprising to us? We've known this for a long time, and it isn't just a pandemic that should be the trigger for us to pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right in saying that we're asking the wrong questions. And I think here in your article, you make us ask the right questions. I love the comparison with America and other countries, outright saying that we've done it wrong. Let's lean into the indigenous population who's doing it right, whose land that, we have just completely stolen. And I think you give some good understanding to memorials in this time of, mass death and social justice and what it can be. Dr. Donald Joralemon, I want to thank you so very much for taking your time to come out to our second of two Rad Death Reads. For anyone that wants more information on this, please go to our website, the Collective for Radical Death Studies. Is www.radicaldeathstudies.com, and under that Decolonizing Death tab, you will see all the information. Look out for information pertaining to our October Rad Death Reads and then our December Rad Death Reads. I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to ask anyone, if you have further questions, keep this conversation going on all of our outlets on Twitter, Rad Death Reads on Facebook, the Collective for Radical Death Studies, and we are on Instagram at Rad Death Reads. So thank you all so very much. Don, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cami. Thank you to all of the members of the book club. And I hope the next time I see you, it won't be on a computer screen.
Absolutely. Wise words. All right. Thank you.